what we are here for tonight is a panel related to Melissa Walter's exhibition up at the top of the hill. So again, hopefully you've gotten to see it. If not, go check it out afterwards. But it's an exhibition of work spanning a number of different mediums, all related to themes of DNA analysis and wrongful conviction. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of the bios of each of our wonderful panelists, and then I'll leave it up to them to talk a bit more about the amazing work that they're all doing. So first of all, we have Melissa Walter here at the end. Melissa Walter is an artist who uses abstraction to translate complex scientific concepts into intimate and accessible visual experiences. Alongside works on paper, Walter uses ceramic, sculpture, and video to investigate DNA identification technology and its application to criminal and civil laws. So give it up for Melissa Walter. Next up, we have Mehul Anjaria to her right, who is in his 28th year of his forensic science career. Mehul has seen the front lines of all sides of the criminal justice system and now enjoys the challenge of bridging science and law. He is a member of the panel of expert witnesses of the County of Los Angeles Superior Court. In 2009, Mehul founded MBA DNA Consulting, LLC to assist criminal defense/civil attorneys and pro-per inmates struggling with complicated forensic DNA issues in their cases. His previous experience includes serving as a DNA technical leader in a law enforcement crime laboratory and co-founding and directing the first DNA lab in California accredited under ISO IEC standards. In 2017, he began working as a consultant on post-conviction cases. Give it up for Mehul. Next up, we have Mike Semanchik, the Executive Director of the Innocence Center, a national organization focused on freeing people who are wrongfully convicted, raising awareness about these cases, and supporting those who have been exonerated. Throughout his career, he has helped free 12 innocent people who together spent more than 200 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. One of his most notable cases was helping exonerate NFL player Brian Banks, which earned him the Attorney of the Year award from California Lawyer magazine in 2013. Mike has also spoken at schools and appeared in the media to discuss his work dozens of times. He's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And finally, last but not least, Luis Vargas is a life coach with the Anti Recidivism Coalition of Los Angeles, conducting workshops at the California Men's Colony State Prison in San Luis Obispo. He works to empower incarcerated individuals to become better people and find meaning in their life, and to change the culture inside of prison. Luis is a certified alcohol drug services specialist and holds an AA in social and behavioral sciences, math and science, and arts and humanities. He is passionate about working with youth and minorities at risk and helping those that find themselves in the position he once found himself, lost and desperate. He aims to start his own foundation to help make this world a better place. So I will turn it over to Mel now to moderate and enjoy the panel.
Good. All right. Well, before we begin this conversation, I just want to thank ICA, everybody here at ICA, for facilitating this discussion, and especially thanking Katerina, because she really did the hard lifting to bring everybody together here today. So thank you to them. Big hand for those guys. And I also wanted to say, this is a really interesting conversation, and I know many of you might come up with some questions, but we only have an hour, so I want to make sure everybody here gets to say what the things that we want them to say. So please hold all your questions at the end. We'll have a little bit of a question period as we wrap up. But to begin, I'm going to be starting with my science guy right here, Mehul. And really, I think the best place to start is for you to talk about what is DNA evidence and how is it processed?
Well, when you talk about what is DNA evidence, it's kind of anything these days. Classically, we'd think, well, it's blood from a crime scene, it's semen from a rape kit, it's a large amount of saliva. But because the sensitivity is so great now, pretty much anything can become DNA evidence. So if you just touch something with your hand, you may leave behind enough DNA that can be detected, and that can become evidence. And we'll talk a little bit later about how the sensitivity of the DNA is almost a problem because it's almost too sensitive, and we have a hard time ascribing meaning to DNA results to low-level samples like that. In terms of how it is analyzed, I'm just going to go through just a real brief history because I know that Mel would want me to do that. So we're 40 years into the use of DNA in forensic science. So roughly about 1986, it was first used in criminal matters. And so the early type of DNA testing was called RFLP, and it used a technique called southern blotting. And you'll see some of those black blobs in Melissa's display. Doesn't look very scientific, actually. But that type of DNA testing would take about 6 weeks to get any kind of result. And on top of that, you would need, for example, a blood stain like the size of a dime. So if you can imagine, there weren't many cases that qualified for DNA testing, and you couldn't get much throughput because if you're spending a month or 6 weeks on a case, it was a very valuable commodity. Then in, I would say, the early, mid-1990s, we started with a technique called PCR. And that allowed the testing to be much more sensitive because we could actually make copies of the DNA that we had in the lab. We didn't have to rely just on the DNA that was at the crime scene. So it was more sensitive and it was faster. But initially, it wasn't as discriminating as RFLP. So with the early PCR systems in the 90s, you couldn't say, well, this DNA profile is found in 1 in 38 quadrillion individuals. It was more like 1 in a million, 1 in several hundred thousand. Then in the early 2000s, we had a better way of doing PCR analysis, and that's using STRs. And Melissa has a diagram of STRs in her show. And this basically did a couple of things. It made the testing more automated, so we could bang out more cases in a year. It was more discriminating. So now those numbers, those awesome numbers, 1 in a quadrillion, things like that, we could accomplish. And so we had the best of both worlds. We were sensitive and we were quick and we were you had a system that you could actually automate better.
Can I interrupt real quick and just have you go further into what does it mean 1 in quadrillion exactly?
Well, early on in DNA analysis, the question was, let's say you had a blood stain at a crime scene and you develop a DNA profile, you test a suspect, you develop a DNA profile, and you see that they're identical. Well, what is the significance of that they're identical? If 1 in 2 people in the world would be expected to match that crime scene profile, that's not very significant. So through population genetics and statistics, you calculate this number. So if it's 1 in a quadrillion, that means that profile is extremely rare. And with the world's population being 1 in 8 billion, that's telling you something very strong.
So that really sounds like, okay, concrete, right? So you get a piece of, you get DNA from some evidence and you get DNA from a suspect and they seem to match. Like, is it possible that it isn't truth? Like, is it possible because humans are part of this process? Does that come into play at all?
Well, the example I used was maybe the most basic, easy type of sample you could have. So when we test DNA, we're looking at a number of individual markers. The kits we use now are 24, 27 markers. If you don't have a sufficient amount of DNA, you might not get results at all the markers. We call that a partial profile. If you have a partial profile, now that statistic's not necessarily 1 in a quadrillion. So you may see a case where DNA was found, so-and-so was included, but then 1 in 100 people would also be included. So that's not unique. Now, I think you're asking me about mistakes, and certainly that can happen. All it takes is for somebody to switch the tubes of 2 suspect samples, and all of a sudden you're going to have mistakes. And unfortunately, these kind of mistakes happen. DNA labs, an analyst twice a year has to do what's called a proficiency test. So they know they're tested, but they don't know the answer to the results. They submit it to the manufacturer and get it back. Well, these are easy cases. First of all, you know you're being tested, so that helps. And they're very simple situations. But you will see labs that have switched samples, that have gotten the analyst will get the wrong answer, but then somebody else will sign off it in the laboratory. So it can be an exact science, but as you say, because humans are involved, and because we're not dealing with nice, pristine clinical samples, it's not like we're doing some kind of test for blood where it's either you have the disease or you don't. We're getting biological material that could be commingled with dirt. It could be commingled with leaves. So you have messy samples. And then we'll talk a little bit about DNA mixtures. Those are much harder to interpret. And yeah, people certainly have been wrongfully included as a potential DNA donor, whereas either a second opinion or better technology showed later that they should have been excluded completely.
I think that's a great moment to talk about the story that you shared with me just the other day. You sent me a link, and I would love that for you to share that with everybody.
Sure. So in about 2012, up in the Bay Area, a rich businessman was at home with his wife, and there was a home invasion, and he was tied up and he was killed. And so as they do, the crime scene investigators took a sample from underneath his fingernails to see if he had struggled with the attacker and there was a transfer of DNA. And so when they did that, they got a database hit to a man by the name of Luis Anderson. Now, there were other samples in the house. This is interesting, they had latex gloves. The perpetrators had latex gloves, and they tried to wash them in the sink. Didn't work. They got a DNA profile off the gloves. That hit a second person. And then there was some duct tape that was used to tie up the residence. That hit on a third person. So glove guy and duct tape guy made some sense in that there was cell phone evidence that backed up their participation in this crime. And maybe most importantly is one of the guys had a sister who was a sex worker who was associated with the victim. So obviously that's why they chose him and all of that. But Luis Anderson, there was no clear other corroboration to his involvement. Now, unfortunately, Luis Anderson liked to drink. So when he talked to his attorneys, he was like, I don't think I did this. Don't remember doing it. Well, he had a great defense team, actually a public defender and an investigator, and they went and pulled his medical records. And what they found is that Luis Anderson had an airtight alibi. On the night of the homicide at the exact same time, Luis Anderson was passed out drunk to the point where paramedics had to get him and take him to the hospital. So he had this airtight alibi. Well, how the hell did his DNA then get to the homicide scene? The same paramedics that scooped up poor drunk Mr. Luis Anderson then went to the homicide scene and tended to the victim. And so somehow, some way, they transferred DNA to the victim's fingernails. Now, I don't think they were covered in blood, and just taking blood from one scene to another, but it just shows you how sensitive DNA testing could be. The most plausible explanation is that the paramedics used something called a pulse oximeter that clips onto the finger. So let's say they used it on Luis Anderson, didn't clean it, and then used it on the homicide victim. That's one way the DNA could have transferred. So, Luis Anderson sat in jail for months before this was resolved. And so we know that this type of transfer happens all of the time, but usually on the defense side, we just have to argue that this is a possibility. But Luis Anderson was a real world example of that. And I have another one I'm going to share just really quickly. A case I had in San Diego just last week. A car full of juveniles was pulled over. They looked in the car and they could see a gun on the floorboard. And in this case, they actually had body cam video. So if you watch the body cam video, you see the arresting officer who's not wearing gloves. He pulls our client out of the car, touching his sweatshirt, proceeds to handcuff him with bare hands. So you see the officer's bare hands touching the defendant's hands as he's handcuffing him, and a lot of significant contact. I think it was 28 seconds that there was hand-to-hand contact. Almost immediately, without putting on gloves or washing his hands, this officer goes and grabs the gun out of the car. He removes the magazine from the gun, and then he racks it to eject a round. So I think that a juror, if they saw that and understood a little bit about DNA, would realize that our client's DNA being on the gun is not a big surprise because the officer very well may have placed it there.
I think that's really great information for everybody. And I know there's much more to talk about on the science side, but I think, talking about a jury and sort of the courtroom process is a great tie-in for Mike now. And Mike, you've worked in the innocence space for a long time now. So I would love for you to just discuss a bit about how long the process is from choosing a person to represent until they're ultimately exonerated, specifically when there is DNA evidence that proves their innocence.
That's a great question. So there are, in California alone, 100,000 people incarcerated right now. There used to be 200,000. We had the biggest prison system in the world until we started to reduce the size because it cost too much. But the reality is there's a lot of people, and studies show that somewhere between 4 and 6% of people in prison are innocent. So that means we're getting somewhere, on average, we're getting about 1,000 applications a year that come in where people are claiming innocence, new applications for assistance. And so we have to figure out from these 1,000, what are the cases that we want to work on? And it's a really challenging thing. It takes a lot of resources to parse through all of these cases and look for the ones that deserve our attention and our limited resources. And so one of the things that we look for initially is there biological material that exists that maybe we could do additional DNA testing? We look at what year were they convicted and what kind of DNA testing existed at the time of trial? What was the status of testing capabilities when the person was convicted? And where are we now? Did they think to do any of the sophisticated testing that we have today? We also look for some of the red flags that you generally see in these wrongful conviction cases, which are, is this an eyewitness misidentification case where there was only maybe one person that saw what unfolded and identified our client? Say they only saw them for 20 seconds at nighttime. There was a gun involved and there's weapons focus. And we know that about a quarter of the cases of the 3,500 documented wrongful convictions in the United States since 1989, about a quarter of those cases have had eyewitness identification as a contributing factor to the wrongful conviction. Is it a false confession potentially? So about 16% of those cases had a false confession. And there's hallmark things to look for when it comes to false confession cases. So we kind of just go through and look for all of the red flags that you might see that we know, because we've been studying these cases for a number of years, what to look for. If we see those, then we move it forward and we try to go and see, does the evidence exist? If the evidence exists, then we'll ask first the prosecution, hey, would you be interested in us doing testing? We have to actually go and argue in court that we should do testing. And sometimes in some counties, like San Diego, the prosecution is okay with doing testing. In some counties, like LA, they're not okay with doing testing. And so we have to battle it out in court. And that takes a significant amount of time. So typically from the day a person writes to us to the point where we're getting into doing DNA testing, it could be 2 to maybe even upwards of 4 years if the court, if we actually have to go through the court and battle for the testing. And then beyond that, it depends on the lab that you're using and what their backlog looks like to actually getting a result. On average, a person spends 13 years in prison wrongfully for a crime they didn't commit. And often it's because there's just limited resources to go through the thousands of cases that are out there and the thousands of people that are requesting assistance. So it is a tedious process, and it is sometimes very difficult to go about proving a person's innocence. There's many more things that play a part in it. Lost evidence is something that happens. I mean, they lose evidence in many cases. They destroy it in many more. We've had cases where a box of evidence has been found in a custodian's closet after 20 years, and it was kind of just, we had been looking for years, and then it all of a sudden turned up. It just kind of depends on the county, and it depends on the particular situation.
So it sounds like there, you just spoke about the roadblocks within this, that process once somebody has been chosen. But I would love for you to also discuss some of the methods that lead to this, to people being wrongfully convicted in the first place.
Sure. There's many reasons why people are wrongfully convicted. As I said, eyewitness identification is one of those contributing factors. The leading contributing factor to wrongful convictions is government misconduct. That is, in more than 50% of the cases, a contributing factor is government misconduct. That's a police officer committing some sort of misconduct, or a prosecutor committing some sort of misconduct, or somebody in a state-funded or government-funded crime lab that commits misconduct. That is the single leading contributing factor in wrongful convictions. We know that there are other things that are contributing along the way, but that right there takes the cake. There's other things, as I said, that we're constantly looking at. Junk science is one. I don't know if anybody's been following the Robert Roberson case out of Texas. Shaken baby syndrome is a theory. It was simply just a theory that all of a sudden became a thing that people were getting convicted of around the United States. And truthfully, it was just that. It was never proven. It's just a theory. There's one study that was done that looked at 700 cases of SBS where the triad existed, and not one of those cases did the study find neck damage. And for those of you that have children, small children, when you have an infant, their neck is not strong enough to hold up their own head. You have to support the head. If there's any shaking that's done to a child at that age, you're going to see neck damage. Now, what we found over the last 20 years, and it's because of security camera footage and doorbells and people videoing just about every part of their lives, is that the same triad exists when kids have short falls from a distance of 2 to 3 feet, falling off a couch or falling off a bed. That same triad exists.
I'm sorry, Mike, can you explain the triad?
So the triad is 3 things that you typically see that these doctors were attributing to shaking. It's bleeding on the brain, it's blood in the eyes, and then there's a third that I'm drawing a blank on right now. But there's this triad that was solely attributed to SBS. We now know that shortfalls cause the same thing, and so too do many diseases that we will see across cases. Blood disorders or AIDS or even pneumonia can sometimes cause the triad. And so we have a plethora of cases where a person has been convicted in an SBS case, where we're now trying to go back and unpack what happened. Often what happens is the person that's convicted is the person that was last in possession or last caring for the child. And it just happens to be just this sort of unfortunate set of circumstances, and that's the person that gets convicted. So junk science, and shaken baby is just one of many. We forever, for 30 years, even more than that, relied on bite mark evidence, where we thought we could look at bruising on a murder victim's body and take a 2D image of the bruising pattern and compare it to a 3D mold of an individual's teeth and say with certainty that it was the same person that left the teeth. And thankfully we have DNA now, so where you think there's a bite, you swab and look for saliva, and we can pretty easily figure out that that's not the person. But for years, people were sent to prison and even to death row based on this junk bite mark evidence. And we've got microscopic hair comparison. We thought that you could look under a microscope and say that hair from a scene is the same as the hair from a potential suspect. And the truth is, if you pull a hair from the front of your head and the back of your head, they might look entirely different under a microscope. And the FBI has come out and said, we were wrong about that. So sorry. Lead bullet analysis, another, where you looked at it and said, okay, we can look at a pack of bullets and the makeup of the lead and the bullets would tell us if it came from the same pack. And that is total BS. Like, that is not something they can do. And so all of the comparative sciences, even fingerprints, what's beautiful about DNA is it's the idea of DNA testing started in a lab. It started as a scientific theory, and we followed the scientific method. And the majority of the other forensic science disciplines did not. They started because police officers were trying to figure out how to solve a crime and try to connect a suspect to a particular scene. And so it started in the wrong area. And so we came into it all wrong. We thought we could do this, and then we tried to make the science work, and it doesn't work. And there's no data to support it. And so that is, one of, I would say probably about 25 to 30% of the cases have junk forensic science as a contributing factor as well.
That can be a little scary as a science person, to think that these methods, they're still being used in court today. And I'm guessing when DNA evidence isn't available, that could be the contributing factor to the prosecution's conversation then. You talked a little bit about percentages, but I would love to talk about some demographics and of people that have been exonerated and what you think that is telling us.
Well, without a doubt, being a minority, you're much more likely to be wrongfully convicted in the United States. In fact, just being Black, you're 17 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted in the United States than if you're not. 17 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted just by being Black. And it's not just, it's baked into our entire criminal legal system. And so you see it all along the way, from the very beginning when you start an investigation all the way through to the point where the prosecution is deciding how to prosecute a case, to picking a jury, to jurors making decisions on how to decide whether or not a person was involved, to even just the language that's used at trial plays a part in whether or not a person is ultimately going to be convicted. One study found that you're 70% more likely to get a conviction if you use the word gang in a trial. Same evidence, one trial says gang, the other one does not. 70% more likely to get a conviction. Why is that? The assumption is that the jurors think that, well, if they didn't do this one, they did something else. But that's not how our system was built, right? Like, we built this criminal legal system to convict people that actually did the crime they're facing, not something you think they may have been involved in because of their connection with other people on the street. And so being a minority absolutely 100% plays a part in all aspects of the criminal legal system, and in particular in wrongful convictions.
I'm curious about gender in exoneration cases.
So in California, we have 33 prisons. Actually, we might be we're down to 27. That's because the prison population has shrunk. We've been able to close 6 prisons. There's only a small, tiny fraction of female prisons. And quite frankly, it's because women don't commit crimes at the level that men do. But what I can tell you is that we have a number of female exonerated persons that we've exonerated. So between the staff and the board of the Innocence Center where I work, we've freed 43 people who have served 650 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Of those, a pretty big number, I think we're at 6 females, which is bigger than the percentage of the prison population, has been wrongfully convicted. And I don't know that I have an explanation as to why that is, why our office has a fair number of female exonerations, but yeah.
Food for thought, I guess. I guess just to wrap up our part of the conversation, on maybe a lighter note, where do you see improvements within these systems that could help hopefully prevent wrongful convictions in the future?
Well, for one, and I'd like to start by thanking each and every one of you for being here, because education is probably the most important thing. We all have a civic duty to sit on juries. Please don't try to skate out of it. Don't try to skip your jury duty. We all know we can.
Oh, wait, we're going to give the call to actions at the end too. So we'll get deeper into that. But specific to the parts of the system that the everyday individual is not,
Yeah.
Please, Mark.
Yeah. So, I mean, education is key. And I would say 20 years ago, most people hadn't ever heard of an innocence organization. You never heard of the Innocence Project. You hadn't heard of the Innocence Center. You hadn't heard of stories like Luis Vargas, which we'll get to. And that's changed. And it's changed largely because of podcasts and Netflix and major motion pictures like Brian Banks's movie. So the issue is ever more in the limelight. And because of that, you all are learning about this issue. And so you're going and holding the prosecution's feet to the fire when they come with not enough evidence. Certainly that's helping. But also, too, the prosecution has been learning as we have. And now, starting around the country, we're seeing conviction integrity units and conviction review units that are started to pop up. And so prosecutors have all the power. And so usually it's these small innocence organizations that are going and making these pitches to, hey, my client is innocent, but we have none of the power. Well, I have to go through the courts to get all of this stuff done. I don't have the power to go haul somebody in and accuse them and sit them down for an interview or do a Perkins operation and put an undercover agent in a prison cell. I can't do that stuff, but the prosecution can. And when they have that power and they use it because they see that they might have made a mistake, all of a sudden, we're starting to see exonerations go through the roof. And so where you have a prosecutor's office that is interested in doing the right thing, they're interested in finding the truth, and they're using their power to go and seek out that truth, you see a big change and a shift in how things are done. We've also just, because of DNA, we've been able to highlight all of these junk sciences we didn't know were junk sciences before. We didn't know bite mark was just garbage. We didn't know microscopic hair comparison was until we could DNA test it. So DNA has really shined a light, and eyewitness identifications. DNA has shined a light on all of the problems. And so it's really allowed us to hyper-focus on all of the issues that we're seeing. It's also brought in science into the forensic science discipline, which we've never had before, where we're doing black box studies to figure out whether or not there's any truth to what's underneath. We've started to look at arson cases different. Like, everything has really just shifted just since I started doing this 16 years ago. So it's not all bad. And I will say too, like, DNA is continuing to get better. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Golden State Killer, and you're following forensic genetic genealogy testing. And now, where we used to have to rely on this thing called CODIS to find an unknown individual, we can now track back to a person through a person's lineage to figure out who actually committed a crime, which in many cases, in my cases, I have to prove who did it, not just that my client didn't. So there's a lot of great stuff happening. And
Mike, can I jump in really quick?
Sure,
with
please.
That? I actually would love to jump back to Mehul to talk about what CODIS is and talk about genealogy and how that's changed the landscape a little bit.
Sure. So let's say a crime lab is working a rape case, and they have a vaginal swab with semen on it, and they develop a full profile, no mixture, full profile, very clear cut. And either they don't have a named suspect, or the suspect that they hauled in, they tested and they excluded him. The next step then would be to put that profile into what's called the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. This is managed by the FBI, and currently there's about 23 million DNA profiles in there. So they're from felony arrestees, convicted felons, missing persons, and then other cases where people they get a DNA profile in a case and they can't match it to anybody. So you would then run this profile in CODIS, and assuming you don't get a hit, the next thing you could do is something called familial searching within CODIS. So the idea is, if you can't get a direct hit on somebody, is it possible that one of their close relatives is in the database? So you may have heard about the Grim Sleeper case in LA. That was, I believe, the first homicide to be solved by this familial searching. Well, that's great because you have CODIS, you have, say, 24 million profiles. Now, if you get into close relatives, meaning like parent or offspring, that database is a little bit bigger. But now we've got the dragnet even bigger with genetic genealogy. So I think most people first heard about that with the Golden State Killer. I mean, that wasn't even the first case it was used on. That was just the most high profile. Now you probably hear every week about a new case that's solved with genetic genealogy. And the idea is this, is that now let's exploit the consumer databases for the genetic profiles because people are using them like crazy, just as hobbyists, try to find out, what your ancestry is. And so the idea now is if you've exhausted CODIS and the familial searching, you do have to have enough DNA to do an entirely different technology. So right now, your local crime lab can't develop the type of profile that you would need for genetic genealogy. But of course, this is a booming industry. There's plenty of private labs that can do that. So let's assume you can develop that profile. Now the cops can enter it into one of these databases and see if there's a hit. Now you're probably not going to get a direct hit on an individual, but now you could hit on a second cousin or a third cousin or maybe even a fourth cousin. And that tells you something. So then that is handed over to really an old school genealogist. And their job is to figure out, okay, this person who left the semen, how are they related to this person that was hit in the database? So they're doing the family trees and all the genetic genealogy. And this has been incredibly successful. And even that part of it has been streamlined. So then what you would do is the genealogist would say, I believe it's this person. So the cops would go over to their house, probably pick through their garbage, swab a beer can or something like that. And then if there is a hit, there's probable cause to arrest that person, take a DNA from his mouth, and then directly compare his sample to that semen evidence of the original rape case. So this is, I guess, the most powerful tool right now in DNA because we don't have to worry. We're not limited to the 25 million people in CODIS. We've got a much larger database that covers a pretty good swath of the population if you consider distant relatives, and that is growing.
Thanks for sharing all that info, Mike and Mehul. It's really, I think, hopefully interesting for everybody, learning some new stuff about our systems and talking about our systems. Luis, let's talk about you and your experience with the system. Now, you were wrongfully convicted for a crime you did not commit, and I would love for you to just talk about your experience. Maybe start with what were the circumstances that led to that wrongful conviction.
First of all, good evening, everybody. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you all for the invitation. I think that one of the circumstances that led to my arrest was that 1997 was an election year. Everybody wants to be tough on crime, right? During election years, right? So especially when there's a high-profile case that has not been able to be closed, people want to get that close because of public pressure, whatever it is, right? So I'm thinking that what happened during the time that I was arrested, I happen to fit the profile of an individual that the FBI was looking for, the TDR, the teardrop rapist. That individual had committed over 30 crimes, 11 of them during the time that I was in custody, by the way. And I fit his description. I had a teardrop. I grew up in South Central. I lived around the areas where the incidents happened. So unfortunately, I had placed myself under the watch of the law as a young man, because I was acting out, whatever, doing what kids do, not thinking about what I was doing. So I'm thinking that those were some of the circumstances that led me to be able to be looked at as they were looking for this individual. And since they could not close a case due to the pressure that was going on and the high profile of it, I'd happen to be the one that the ball fell on. He fits the description. He's been sought out by the law. So you know what? Let's just go ahead and put a lid on the case. Let's close it. And we could just let the public know that we found the individual, teardrop rapist, committed over 30 sexual assaults. So I'm thinking that those were some of the circumstances.
Because of the crime that you were charged for, that you did not do. That gave you a specific experience in prison. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Boy, it's nothing short of a horror script, right? I know what happens to individuals in the system that are accused of being rapists, child molesters, and stuff like that. Some of them get in there, they get raped by foreign objects, they get beat on,
We do have children in the audience. So
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, they do, and I apologize for that. And I knew what could happen to me if I ended up in the system with that type of charge. So I had to automatically jump in survival mode and think of how was it that I was going to be able to survive during the time that I would be in there, right? I refused to be placed in a protected custody yard because I'd never committed the crimes. So I said, why am I going to be placed in a PC yard? That's what they refer to them. So I didn't want to go through life with that label, especially while I was in prison. So I went ahead and I thought about ways that I could go ahead and survive while in the system. So I began to conjure up a story of being a third strike and having been arrested for first-degree burglary. And everybody that would ask me, even when they would ask for my paperwork to find out why I was there for, I would tell them that lie, that I was in there for first-degree burglary, and I was a third striker, and I had been sentenced to 55 years to life. So, I had to jump on survival mode.
That must have been a really difficult experience, especially as somebody who did not commit the crime. And how long was that experience for you? How long were you incarcerated for?
I got arrested in 1997, fought my case all the way to 1999. Newspapers and broadcasts say that I've been in there for 16 years, but I was in there for 18. I spent 2 years fighting my case, 18 years altogether. And all those 18 years that I was in there, I was always on survival mode, on a general population. I had conjunctured of some 128 Gs, were informational papers that said that I was in there for first-degree burglary. And every time that prison politicians would ask for my paperwork to be verified and to make sure that I was clear to be in the yard, they would take it with them. They would analyze it. And, it was 18 years altogether.
So you did a podcast with Mike, so I know your story from that podcast. And one thing that I thought was sort of an interesting turning point for you was the moment that you realized, okay, now I can go to these lawyers and maybe this will help my case. There was an event that happened while you were watching television.
I had lost my appeal back in 2000, 2001, 2002. I lost my appeal, and I had already resignated myself to just spending life in prison, And I wrote over 20 letters to different projects that I thought would be able to probably help me out, right? Because the only thing that will be able to get me back into the court system was going to be either new evidence or if I did the paperwork myself. So I have two left feet when it comes to legal stuff, right? I don't know, So what I did was that I wrote all these letters to all these different projects. And on one occasion, I was sitting in my cell by myself, and I'm writing a letter, and I have my TV volume down on low. And out of nowhere, man, it's just like it was like a spark of hope just hit my cell, right? Because out of nowhere, I hear KCAL9 news report out of downtown Los Angeles, serial rapist on the loose. So I'm over here like, wait a minute, that's what I'm here for. So what I did, I turned around, I sat in front of my bunk, looking at the TV, I turned it up, and I started listening to how they were describing every little issue, every instance, every modus operandi, everything that man did, the way it happened, the way he approached the victims, the way he looked, what he did, everything that happened down to a T. So what I did was that as soon as that happened, I turned it all the way up, and I grabbed the pencil and I started scribbling away. I started writing. Everything, I started writing so crazy. Like I must have gone like maybe about 6 or 7 pages, all scribbles, right? As soon as that interview was over, I turned around, I sat on my desk, and I started writing everything down legit, the way I was supposed to be able to understand it, right? So as I was doing that, I went ahead and sent it to the California Innocence Project at that time, now the Innocence Center. And lo and behold, man, thank God, that was the letter later on down the line. Justin Brooks tells me that was the letter that motivated them to go ahead and look into my case more seriously, because everything fitted like a glove, so. But that's the one thing that happened that broke my case.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point to make. And Mike, maybe you can, talk about that a little bit too, is these cases really do need sort of maybe somebody else that it points to in order to, or high profile, in order to really be able to help somebody through their process.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly helps to. It's a lot easier to go to the prosecution and say, we found out who did it. It's these people or this person. It's not our client. Because now they can then fall back on that. It's not that, in a lot of cases, we'll do DNA testing and we might get an exclusion. So in other words, that's really cool. We get an exclusion. So we do DNA testing and our person is excluded, but we still don't know who it is. Well, the prosecution might come back and say, well, the absence of your client's DNA doesn't prove they're innocent. It just proved they didn't leave their DNA behind. Or they might say, well, that other person's DNA that's there, they're the unindicted co-conspirator, the person we didn't know they did the crime with. And you're like, so you come up with a brand new theory to rebut what I'm telling you. Okay, so in a lot of cases, it is just easier if you can point towards the true perpetrator. And that's what happened in Luis's case. As I had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of cases in which they throw evidence away. And in his case, he had been accused and convicted of a couple of crimes. And in those crimes, we didn't have DNA evidence in all of those cases. But what we did have was that the MO was the same across all of them. And so the DNA testing that we were able to do pointed to the teardrop rapist and not to Luis.
I mean, I think that's just an amazing moment, right? That you had the fortune of watching television, at that very moment and seeing that newscast. But thankfully that led to your exoneration. How long have you been outside of prison?
I am happily going on 8 years and 5 months, actually. Woo! I was released in May 26th of 2016. And, it took me a couple of years to be able to get acclimated back into society. Man, I heard sirens. Next thing you know, I wanted to prone myself out in the middle of the street. I heard, as I'm getting across the street, I hear the light telling me, wait, I'm over here. What the, because I don't know. I mean, it's a new world for me, So I came out with a lot of traumas. I'm still dealing with some, even as I do my cohorts inside. I still have nightmares. I still have night sweats, but those 18 years, they left back a lot of scars. And I thank you guys for being here tonight, because you guys are where it begins. You guys look a lot like the jury of my peers that convicted me. Okay, don't take it personal. I'm just saying, all of you that are looking or getting summoned for juries, please take it seriously. Take your job seriously, because convicting me in the courtroom was drama, not evidence, not it was hearsay and drama. That's all that convicted me. And I mean that with all due respect. I love you guys for being here. You guys are awesome. You guys can make a difference. We have a broken system and it needs to be changed.
I'm definitely getting back to the jury duty part in just a little bit. But one thing I would love to hear about is what you are talking about, sort of the scars that this experience has left you. I have a two-part question. One, do you feel like there are resources available to you to help with that? And two, are you becoming a resource as well for people who have experienced some, similar?
When I first got out, there weren't any resources. The only resource I had at that moment was the Edmund Walking Fund. They helped me out with $2,000 to be able to get out. I didn't come out with the California ID. I came out with my state prisoner identification, picture ID. So in order for me to be able to get started to get my life back on track again, I had to present a picture ID everywhere I went. So even in the Mexican consulate, when I went there to present to get my birth certificate so I could get my picture ID from the driver, from the DMV, I had to present a picture ID, and I didn't have one. And I told my lawyer, should I show them my prisoner ID? He says, only as a last resort. One day we went to the Mexican consulate. I couldn't get my birth certificate. My mother seen a bunch of La Opinión newspapers on the door, and she grabbed like about 9, 10, 12 of them because my picture was on the front page. And when they refused to give me my birth certificate because I didn't have a picture ID, she went ahead and grabbed the newspaper, slammed it on the desk, and said, is that enough of a picture ID for you? My son was convicted for 18 years for crimes he didn't commit. Is that enough of a picture ID for you? And the attorney from the consulate just looked at me and said, is that true? I go, yes. Well, resources. Edmund Walking Phone was a great one. Other than that, I did not really have any resources to fall back on. So it would be nice for them to come up with some type of more resources. I'm pretty sure that right now, nowadays, we have some, the organization I work for, ARC, the Anti Recidivism Coalition, Community Solutions, which is also another organization I've worked for, because now since you went ahead and asked, what am I doing now? I was fortunate enough to graduate as an ADS, Alcohol Drug Service Specialist Counselor 1 and 2. I came out of prison. I'm starting to do what my passion is about. I'm serving the community. I work with ARC as a life coach. I go back. Interestingly enough, I got out of prison to go back in. And second day I went in there, I told my escort, man, I started laughing to myself. He goes, what's going on, Vargas? I go, man, you know what? I would have never thought I'd think this. And he goes, what's that? I told him, I'm glad to be back in prison. And I tell my participants, I tell them all the time, you know what? I'm not just saying that because I'm going to leave at 8:30, 4:30, 8:30 in the evening. I'm saying that because I'm coming in here to transform the minds, the criminal thinking. I'm trying to transform the culture in prison. And that's exactly what I'm doing nowadays. You know, I go in there Monday, Tuesday, Thursdays. I'm having workshops. I'm having success. 3 of my participants just paroled. Two others got found suitable. And you know what? We're doing the best we can. You know, so that's what I'm doing for the community now. I'm contributing. And I think that that's one of the best ways. Think about it, gentlemen, ladies. You guys were spending over $978,000 a year to house me in prison. And I was innocent. Do the math. I've been out 8 years. How much have you saved?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Luis, for all that. Seriously, I mean, we should all be grateful for the work that you're doing right now. Yes, please, big round of applause for sure. So as we wrap up this conversation, I'm going to open up to everybody here. Let's talk about now we can get back to the jury duty shaming. And actually, I have a couple questions about jury duty, but I do want to talk about ways that we as community members that are not necessarily work within these systems, ways that we can shape the system in better directions and move the needle. And jury duty is something that both of you have mentioned. But you also gave us lots of other information, right, about what is happening in the courtroom that could push wrongful convictions. Can you talk about, as a juror, how can somebody help with those problems? Can we help as a juror with those problems?
So as a juror, you bring your own unique experience into the courtroom and into the deliberation room. And so as best you can, go out and educate yourselves on all of these issues and all of these things that we've talked about tonight. Go and watch all of the wrongful conviction stories and movies and shows that you can. Start listening to podcasts, understand, and start focusing on some of the forensic sciences that are out there that maybe we shouldn't trust. When you go in there and you're sitting as a juror, you have an opportunity to decide whether you think the expert that either side has put on is credible or not. you have an opportunity to decide whether this is just drama in front of you, whether this is just something to get your emotions going, or whether there's actually true, solid evidence that connects a person to a particular crime. Like, it's on you as a member of society, as a juror, to make that decision, and you take it back into the deliberation room and you make the call. And you and the other 11 people that are in there are the ones that make the ultimate decision, and you come back out and tell the court what you decide. So you have every opportunity to learn and study these things and then go and use your knowledge to have an impact in the system. What we see all the time when you're actually going and trying cases is that, as Luis said, it's not typically a very diverse group of people that is going in for jury duty, unfortunately. It's people that have time to go for jury duty. But we can all make time for jury duty, and we should. So, I mean, that's definitely one thing. Now, there's a couple other things that I would love for you all to do, and that's just, as we come upon this election in the next couple of weeks, study up, and every election really, but study up who is running. And I don't just mean like on the national level. Really, what's most important is looking at some of the local election stuff that's on the ballot. And so, who's your prosecutor that's running for election? Who is running for sheriff? Like, these things matter. And the way that they approach the criminal legal system can have a drastic impact on your local community and really shape whether or not a wrongful conviction is coming out of your local jurisdiction or not. So you really need to do your homework on, and one thing I think that often falls to the wayside is judges. We never do our homework on who the judges are, but they matter just as much as many of the other people that are participating in the criminal legal system, because they have an opportunity to keep some of this drama at bay, keep some of the evidence out that shouldn't be in. There's a lawyer that used to be a defense attorney in town named Chris Plord, who's now a judge out in Imperial County. And he is a person that really studied forensic science. Well, now he's leading and he's teaching judges all over the United States, not just in California, but about junk science and what, as judges, they should be keeping out. They're the gatekeepers to decide whether evidence should be in or out. And he's doing his part to make sure that bad junk science is kept out of the courtroom. So make sure you study up on your judges too.
Just to let everybody know, I don't know if we have the QR code up or no. We might not have a QR code, but if you go to the ICA, oh yes, up at my show, up at the top of the hill, there's a QR code, and that leads to a page on the ICA website where everybody here shared a number of links with us, so that these could be good resources, and hopefully, if you guys ever come up with other things that can help, I find when it comes to voting for judges and DAs and whoever else, that's the harder part to research, because there's just generally not as much information. So when I can't find information, then I generally don't want to vote, because I don't want to vote against my own interests. So hopefully, as stuff comes up, maybe that's something we can continue to share with the community. Do any of you want to take on Prop 36 or Prop 6 conversation?
Well, I was just going to add something to what Mike said. I think in general, we need to look at the defense bar a little bit differently. And 10 years ago, you might hear wrongful conviction. Oh, okay, well, stuff happens once in a while. But now we hear them every week. So we can't deny that the system's broken. And, as a juror, I know you go into court and you see the guy shackled and with the prison jumpsuit on, and you can't maybe help but think, well, he's got to be here for a reason. And I think a lot of times, though, people look at the defense attorney as annoying, that they're the bad guy, they're the dark side. And I think based on the wrongful convictions now, we have to really know that the defense has a seat at the table.
So I think I would love to talk about Prop 36 and Prop 6 if you guys want to take any of that on. If not, I can.
May I?
Yes, please. Luis.
Prop 6. I have a lot of participants inside of the system that cannot show up to my workshops. because of forced labor. Because they're being forced. They're told that, you know what, that if you don't show up to your work site, even if it's just a yard crew position, or even if it's a cook position inside of the kitchen, or maybe behind the wall, they want to punch them, threaten them to punish them, give them a 115, give them a 128, which are the most difficult ones to argue, and they look worse on the board than anything else, because you can't appeal them. You cannot appeal a 128. It's a documentation, a disciplinary documentation that will definitely hurt them. So I think that Prop 6 is something that we should definitely vote yes on, because I believe that individuals that are in the system should not be forced to work for 16, 18, 32 cents, 52 cents an hour, simply because they need to have individuals that do those functions. When CDC was added, the R to CDC, I was inside of the system at that time. And ironically, when they added the R for rehabilitation, everything started disappearing. Janitorial disappeared, automotive disappeared, carpentry disappeared. All of these programs behind the wall started disappearing. Wait a minute, it's in the R for rehabilitation. Well, these programs help. But they started, you know what's the only behind the wall position that was left open at that time? Office services. Why do you think that was? I mean, 2 and 2 is 4, right? Well, my thing is that I think that was left open because correctional officers need to have clerks. I used to be a clerk. I used to work. I used to do the 115s. I used to do the dispositions. So now I was behind the wall and I was working for all them years to do their job, when all they were doing was sitting down on benches inside of yards and let the inmates do all the work. Well, I mean, it's good for them to work. However, it's better for them to reform themselves, to transform themselves, to rehabilitate themselves. And we offer them these things through workshops such as Criminal Gangs Anonymous, Emotional Intelligence, YOP programs, Avatar, which is our board preparation program. And I don't think that they should be penalized for not wanting to work, but to show up to these workshops. So I think that Prop 6 would actually be a good proposition for us to pass on right? Prop 36, on the other hand, I think that Prop 36 would set us back. That's my personal opinion. I think that Prop 36 would once again begin mass incarceration, which is what I'm working against.
Can I just let everybody know what Prop 36 is really quickly? So Prop 36 will allow felony charges and increases sentences for certain drug and theft crimes.
Yes, that's what it is. Remember when the third strike law came out? They were trying to sentence people that stole the Snicker bar for 25 to life. People that stole a steak for 25 to life. We'll be looking back at these days. So I encourage you as voters, to go ahead and exercise your voting vote. Get people out there, because you guys are right there. You guys could make this happen.
Well, on that note, I want to turn to all of you and see if anybody here today has any questions. I know we've given a lot of information, a lot to digest, and hopefully so much information that we've actually answered the questions you had. But does anybody in the audience have any questions?
You mentioned integrity units.
Yes.
So if you could just speak a little bit more, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but
Mike.
Science guy. Science guy. You spoke a little bit about human error. That it happens. Yes, somebody's gonna switch a tube. We have fail safes, but they're not always safe. They're not 100%. Given the stakes, given 18 years of a wrongful conviction and your life in prison, given what can happen and all the power that the prosecution has, do you think it's a good idea to have an integrity unit in every single prosecutor's office? And what would it take to get that done?
It's absolutely necessary in every prosecutor's office. There are a number of things that have to happen with the integrity unit for it to be, like, you can't just announce that you have one. And there are counties in California that have done that, ones that I take cases in that aren't far from here. And what's unfortunate is that, sometimes they'll use it as a political tool, like I'm doing the right thing because I have this conviction integrity unit, but they're a conviction integrity unit in name only, and then they don't actually do anything. But the most important thing is independence. The conviction integrity unit needs to have the independence to go and do an investigation into the crime without outside influence from the trial prosecutor, who might be interested in defending their conviction and their ego and everything else. You have to have no influence from the law enforcement agency that did the initial investigation, because that agency might be on the hook for some later civil suit when it turns out they didn't turn over evidence of innocence that they had all along. So these kinds of the units are absolutely necessary. The independence is a key component to it, and they have to be well funded. They have to be staffed with attorneys that can actually go through all of the cases, and investigators and paralegals to make sure that they have what's necessary to go and find these cases of innocence. And, I think the other thing, that one of the most effective conviction integrity units that exist, so Dallas County in Texas, Philadelphia has one of the best ones in the United States. LA has really come a long way with George Gascon. But one of the most important things is not to look at the cases with the idea that you have to meet some sort of legal standard. Look at the case and just look for the truth. Like, we're after the truth. Our system is built on this idea of finality, that once the jury comes back and finds a person guilty, we're stuck with it. And we make it incredibly difficult to reverse any conviction. And when you have a conviction integrity unit that's really just focused on finding the truth, and they put behind them the finality that we've all built this system on, you see a lot of progress. So I think every county needs to have them, and they need to come with resources and independence, and with this idea that you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you're going to find when you start peeling back the layers of the onion, and you got to just take it for what it is when it hits you in the face, because it's going to hit you in the face.
Conviction integrity unit played a major part in my case.
At 100% true. We probably, if we would have just gone to court and tried to battle it out, we would have lost in his case. In fact, the way the standard was written in 2016, 2015, we would have lost. And if it wasn't for the lawyer in the habeas unit in LA, Luis probably wouldn't be sitting here.
Actually, I have two, and these are quick ones, I think. For the innocence guy and for the scientific guy. If the O.J. Simpson case was today, how would the preponderance of the evidence be in the prosecution, would you say? And the scientific guy, if I put a drop of my blood with a drop of your blood, would you be able to differentiate the both of us?
Mixtures absolutely can be handled. In your particular scenario, where there's a lot of DNA from two people, you might expect something like a 50-50 mixture, and that can be resolved. Sometimes you could get a mixture of 4 people, and maybe there's like a 2% contributor, and there might be like a 90% contributor that you can pull out a profile, but these lower contributors, if they're like 2%, you may not be able to. By the way, you bring up a good point, because DNA mixture interpretation is really a hot topic right now in terms of lack of subjectivity. So although we have better systems to interpret even more complicated mixtures than what you described, we're having some problems with standardizing it, and maybe more importantly, how it's conveyed to the jury in court. Essentially, some of the analysts don't quite understand it themselves. So when they explain it to the jury, they are mischaracterizing what the evidence actually is.
As for OJ, so Barry Scheck is a friend of mine who started the Innocence Project in '92 and was one of O.J. Simpson's lawyers. I mean, it would be an entirely different case today. It would, because of DNA. It would, because of all of the things that you would have today. He would most likely would have had a cell phone on him. It probably would have put him at the scene. If he didn't have a cell phone, or if it was switched off, you'd be like, well, why was your cell phone off, right? But the DNA at this crime scene, it would have been a totally different. Interestingly, Barry, who started the Innocence Project and relies on DNA to get all of the exonerations that their office has done, did a fairly decent job beating up DNA in the OJ case. and arguing how unreliable it was based on a number of different things. So I think it would be an entirely different case today, just with all of for any of you out there, if you think you can commit a crime today and get away with it, good luck.
And that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, guys, for being part of this. And thank you to ICA.